As we continue our study of the sanctity of life, some of you may be wondering, sanctity of life, I thought this would be over in like three studies, 3 or 4 sessions. Well, here we are. You can look at the number on the top, session 14. My gosh, how can you have 14 and more on the sanctity of life? That's because the sanctity of life is so thoroughly important and foundational for understanding not only the heart of God and the character of God, but really the entire story of redemption that goes from cover to cover, Genesis to Revelation. And I've mentioned to you that it's really important that when we understand the sanctity of life, that it is not a one political issue. And what I mean by that is that when we talk about the sanctity of life, it incorporates the entirety of creation, the entirety of God's story of redemption, and what it means to honor people's lives, even if they don't believe in God. Because at the end of the day, each life is sacred, not because we deem it so, or we determine whose life is sacred, but because of God's inherent nature and character and determination that our life is sacred, because we all are made in God's image, regardless of whether or not we believe in God. That's irrelevant. We're all made in God's image, and there's nothing that robs us of that fact and that dignity and sanctity of life. As we read the Sermon on the Mount in the portion today in chapter 5, you're going to see how true that statement is and just how sacred life is. Now, how you reconcile Jesus' teachings with your own life, with your own political posture, with your own cultural engagement, or your own sense of where you fit in the world is up to you. We are, after all, Baptists. And as Baptists, we believe that you are responsible for your understanding of Jesus' teachings and how to follow Jesus' teachings. But one of the things you can't do as a Christ follower is claim that you're a Christian and ignore Jesus' teachings. So how you get to the practical meat and potatoes of it is your responsibility under the lordship of Christ in your life, but you can't ignore Jesus' teachings one way or the other. Matthew 5:17 through 48, Jesus is moving into the next part of his Sermon on the Mount, and he gives within this section 6 what are called transforming initiatives that outline Christian practices. He says within these verses that your righteousness as a disciple is to be greater than that of a Pharisee. Now, that says a lot about the Pharisees. Jesus, for as much trouble and as much conflict he has with the Pharisees, does honor those leaders in the community who are seeking to make things right in their own way. Now, it's not always right how they do so, and Jesus is there to correct them, but at the same point, he's saying that, but your righteousness as now a Christ follower, is to be a righteousness that exceeds those in the world who are trying to kind of police everyone else. Righteousness is about right relationships, right standing, And so the Christian practices, the behaviors that Jesus sets out are not things that are impossible or high ideals. They are behaviors that Jesus expects of us. This idea of transforming initiatives comes from a book called Kingdom Ethics. I showed it to you a few weeks ago by Glenn Stassen and David Gushee, both ethicists. David Gushee was my ethics professor, and I told you last week, read a lot of his books and admire him. He's a very humble, godly man. And this is what they write in the book. This is not a high ideal to be admired from a distance, but an actual practice. Now, he's just using one transforming initiative, but he's talking about it in general. It is not an impossible teaching, but is in fact practiced regularly by many of us. It solves problems. It is the way of deliverance from vicious cycles of anger and insult. Nor is it legalism. It is the way of grace. The way God takes toward us in Christ, and the way we can participate in God's grace mediated through community. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each part, and then we're going to see what Jesus says, and then the transforming initiatives. So let's read 5:17 through 20, and then bring out a few points. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, Not one stroke of the letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so what does Jesus mean when he says, I came to fulfill? A lot of people think that came to end the law. Now, what we learn is that Jesus didn't come to end the law, meaning fulfill, to end it, but rather it's the heart of the law, the intent of the law comes into fruition in the person of Christ. And it's through his teaching and his presence, God with us, that we can live now the heart, the intention of the law. God, to allow our heartbeat to match the heartbeat of God, and to live the law not according to legalistic thous and these and do's and don'ts, but rather the heart or the intention of the law. And that's what those transforming initiatives is. Jesus takes 6 such laws, broad, overreaching laws, and says, you've heard it said, but I say to you, and what Jesus does is brings out the heart, the character, and gives a new moral vision. But there's something else happening under the text. Jesus is moving the law, okay, the heart of the law, away from the Torah and placing this is big words, but I think you can follow this, the orbit, or the heart of the law within himself. So what's happening is you're moving from a Torah-based kind of righteousness, based on Torah. Okay, those are the laws in the first 5 books of the Bible. And now the law of God, or the Word of God, is now embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. That's why in John 1 it says the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became what? Flesh. So the Word, Torah, okay, the Word of God, where God's presence was mediated through the Torah to the people of Israel, is now embodied as God has come with us in the person of Jesus Christ. And Jesus now embodies the heart of the law to bring to fruition, not to reinvent the legalism that stifles, but to free us up to live through the heart of the law as Christ followers. Okay, as Christ followers. So this is, and what's interesting is, many of you know Rabbi Michael, because he came to teach one night. We have lunch all the time, and he'll say, oh yeah, our Torah reading every Sabbath is like your communion. We read Torah, you all take communion. And what's interesting is, even though he's Jewish, and strictly Jewish, is he's really revealing a truth of Christianity, that we move from Torah to now the Word of God, the person of Jesus Christ, and symbolized through that death and resurrection, that God's body was broken for us, and God's blood was shed for us through communion. It's an interesting thing. He says it often. And I think, boy, that sounds like good Christian theology right there, Rabbi. Notice the emphasis on teaching. Jesus doesn't just share this. Jesus expects us to teach it. And that's going to be reiterated in the Great Commission. Go make disciples, baptize, and teach them what I have taught you. Teach them what I have taught you. Okay, it's not enough just to report to the convention, the SBC, that we have 10 or 15 baptisms. We need to do discipling. And I'm not saying SBC doesn't emphasize that. I'm just saying it's not enough for us to just get numbers. Discipling is really how we connect our faith to the Christian life. And the Christian life, again, you don't have to make up things. It's all right here in the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of 5 teachings of Jesus in the book of Matthew. Jesus gave us everything we need. All right? And then righteousness is putting into practice that behavior. Jesus is not expecting us to just say, oh, that's a nice thought, that's cute. I'll do that in my private time. I'll just think about it. And I'm holy because I thought about it. No, Jesus expects us to put this into practice. We've been talking about transforming initiatives. Let's go ahead and move to Matthew 5:21 through 26. And I want to show you how this works this kind of equation that Stassen and Gushee kind of come up with about how this works, okay? Matthew 5:21 through 26, Jesus is concerned about life. So this is his first transforming initiative. You have heard it said that it was to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar and go. First be reconciled, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your ancestor while you are on the way. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. I want you to look at your notes very closely, because these transforming initiatives have these equations, and you're going to be asked to fill them out in a minute. That's why I'm kind of trying to get through this, to kind of give you the opportunity to see if you can break it down in the next few transforming initiatives. David Gushee and Glenn Stassen proposed 3 parts to each transforming initiative, or at least groups of them. There's first a traditional righteousness. Okay, you see this in your paper here? Matthew 5:21. You have heard it said, do not murder. Then there's the vicious cycle. You have heard it said, do not murder. But I say to you, if you are angry, you'll be liable to judgment. If you insult, if you call somebody a fool. Let's talk about this real briefly. Anger in the Greek is not, you're angry and annoyed. It is an ongoing resentment, okay? So anger in this context is, you get maybe angry with a loved one, you get annoyed. It's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a seething resentment, an ongoing action. Ephesians 4:26 says, do not let the sun go down on your anger, right? So that means that, don't let it seethe. Don't let it build to resentment. Insult, if you insult your brother or sister, the word insult is a form of abuse. So I want you to think about this. Anger starts where? Here, right? The heart and the head, the mind. Heart and the head. And then you start dwelling on it. And then you start losing sleep. And then your resentment really builds. I know this has never happened to any of you guys. And then you start to talk about the person, right? You call up your daughter or your loved one. You say, boy, this person, right? And then you move to calling that person a fool. So notice how it moves from the heart and the mind to the mouth, right? To the action. Okay, so we have the traditional righteousness. You have heard it said, do not murder. The vicious cycle. Notice how the cycle gets worse and worse. It moves from a heart problem to letting that problem fester to the point where you're talking about it, to a direct action of dehumanizing another person. Okay? So you dehumanize. Okay? Sow the seed of discord, then you start talking, and then you start to dehumanize to where the person loses their personhood, their humanity. And now they become just an object of abuse. Okay? Now, so that's the cycle. And verse 23 and 24, by the way, that's an imperative. Oh, I'm sorry, I did the first. Okay, so you have the traditional righteousness, the vicious cycle, and then number 3, the transforming initiative. Matthew 5:23 through 26, not 523. Okay, transforming initiative. So you have the traditional righteousness, you have heard it said, do not murder, the vicious cycle, which we talked about, and then the transforming initiative. Notice verse 23 is an imperative. Okay, so and what that means is, if you're offering your gift and you remember that someone has something against you, leave your gift and go. An imperative is a command. It's not think about it. It's not, well, consider it. No, you leave your gift and go. Notice how the transforming initiative, when it comes to relationships, is set in the context of worship. You notice that? Jesus doesn't say, hey, you're making a sandwich and you think your brother and sister, go. Now, you may have to do that while you're making your sandwich. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the context that Jesus chose to use in his command to reconciliation is set in the context of worship. You can't worship. That lack of reconciliation will inevitably hinder your worship. It'll get in the way of true worship if you're not reconciled with that person with whom you have a difference. So Jesus uses kind of the most sacred act of coming to God and offering yourself when part of you is in bondage to the person that you resent. Does that make sense? Okay, you can't offer God your whole self when part of you is living in the dungeon of resentment and despair. Okay? Now I want to remind you that this doesn't happen overnight. Okay? It's not like this Sunday you're going to put your offering in the plate or take communion or whatever, or worship, and say, I have to listen to this and I can't come back to church until I make things right. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes it takes a few months. Sometimes it takes a year or so, okay, to go through the brokenness of relationships. They're very complicated. The point is that the transforming initiative breaks that cycle of resentment and bondage and brokenness. How you get there, the Lord needs to help you with that, okay? The reason why I say that is because, it takes sometimes years to get over things, and sometimes, sometimes you just can't. Another part of the Bible says if you seek reconciliation with I think it's Matthew 18. No, it's 1st or 2nd Timothy. If you seek reconciliation and they just don't listen, just walk away. Just don't have anything to do with that person. And sometimes that happens. But you need to make sure you're letting it go if that happens. And those are under circumstances where you just can't see eye to eye. And that happens. But we're talking about a frame of mind that leads to a vicious cycle and a transforming initiative. Now, I want to do this with the next transforming initiatives 2, 3, and 4 actually work together. And notice I give you the 3 little cycles: the traditional righteousness, the vicious cycle, and transforming initiative. And you're going to fill out the verses, okay? And the reason why I want to do this is, 1, to teach you how to read these. 2, even though we're switching to relationships that have to do with like marriage and divorce and so on and so forth, we're still talking about the sanctity of life. Because you have to remember that Jesus' world was one in which some lives were not considered as sacred or not treated as sacred. Namely women, okay? Women and children, but mostly women. The children he deals with later when he says, let the children come unto me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But for right now, he's moving from relationships of resentment to the most vulnerable, and each one deals with a different kind of sanctity of life, kind of ethic. So I'm going to read for you 5:27 through 37. There are 3 transforming initiatives, but you're going to see that they work together when it comes to this three-part kind of equation. So let's go ahead and read it, okay? 5:27 through 37, and then we'll take questions. I know I'm going fast, but I kind of want to get it all out so we can have the rest of the time to talk. Verse 27. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Notice it starts with the heart. Okay? If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Verse 31, it is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said, said of those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. All right, now, we're dealing with three different transforming initiatives, and the reason why I grouped them together is because there's only one there's only one kind of wrap-up. And what I mean by that is Jesus gives two traditional righteousness, kind of two laws, and then two vicious cycles, and then one big transforming initiative that comes at the end. So the traditional righteousness is Matthew 5:27. You have heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery." The second one is in verse 31. You have heard it said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." So we have verse 27 and verse 31, which are the traditional righteousnesses. Okay? And then the third one, you shall not swear falsely, verse 33. So I should have put a third little line there. Okay? 33. The vicious cycle that comes is in verse 28, which has the lust. Okay? And then verse 32, which has the adultery, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It's probably if all of you have questions about that. And I have a story about that. And that's it. So the vicious cycle is verse 28 and 32. The transforming initiatives are, you can count the cutting out the eyeballs as a transforming initiative, but that's a hard one to swallow. I don't see anyone who's blind or without hands here. So we're going to talk about that. But I think the transforming initiative for all of these is wrapped up within verse 34 through 37. Because divorce, marriage, and oaths are all about promise keeping. Okay? So that's why I put them together, because these three transforming initiatives are about promise keeping. Okay? He talks about divorce, he talks about adultery, he talks about divorce, and then he talks about oaths. All three have to do with promise keeping. That's why I grouped them together. The intent of two out of these three is to protect women. Okay, so let's go ahead and get that out right away and say that Jesus is speaking to who? Men. Okay? Because in his world, men were seen as hierarchically higher than women, to the point where they believed that women were almost right above cattle when it came to personhood. And because of that particular worldview, only men could ask for a divorce. Or in the Jewish world, only men can file for divorce. Now, I think women legally can do it in the Roman world, if there was like adultery or abuse, but men were allowed in the Jewish kind of Pharisaic law to get a divorce. And this was being abused. Like all laws that have loopholes. Okay, you call it a marriage loophole. If you're a man, you have a loophole, you can get out of it. And apparently this was being abused because if you believe that a woman is no more better than just cattle, you're going to eventually treat women like that. And it was becoming a vicious cycle of abuse and divorce. Okay? So Jesus' focus on men and protecting the most vulnerable, women, okay, not only upholds the sanctity of life of women, okay, but also seeks to right very fundamental wrongs in society, which was this kind of abuse of this divorce system. And then he wraps it up with that transforming initiative about keeping your promises. Let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Okay? So let's go through it just one by one, and then we'll open it up for discussion. The first transforming initiative, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with a lust has already committed adultery in his heart. So remember, it starts in the heart and the mind, and it goes through action. Well, Jesus is going to cut off the action by telling you to pluck out an eye and cut off your hand. You guys are amazing. None of you have lusted, because I see everyone with their eyes and hands intact. Now you get the sense that Jesus is really utilizing hyperbole. He's a good teacher, okay? The master teacher uses, just like we do, illustrations or hyperbole to say that this is serious business, and we're going to uphold the sanctity of life of those to whom we make promises. Then he goes specifically in divorce. So let me talk a little bit about this because I know you have questions. I say to you that anyone who divorces a wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, if you're in a relationship and only one party abuses their ability to divorce and sends a woman on her way, that relationship is still intact, according to Jesus. Okay? Now, several things kind of work in this, and this is just my personal thought, and I'll tell you a story. For the first thought is, people didn't live very long in this kind of world. You know, they only lived to like 30 or 40, maybe 50. There were some older, but, you know, it wasn't the most sanitary of conditions. So if you're going to stay married for like 10 or 15 years, we're not talking about like 60-year marriages, unless you're talking about like Zechariah and Elizabeth. So there were some, but marriages back then, it wasn't like now where you go to a bar and you meet 1,000 people. You get married and that's it. Okay? So the expectation is you stay married. The second thing is that Jesus, in declaring kind of this kind of ethic, is really talking about fidelity and the lack of fidelity, but at the same time, I think he's still in the vein of hyperbole.